Okay, hello everyone. It's a great time to be around in Paleolithic archaeology at the moment. Some I think, very exciting things that are happening. I always sort of liken it to waiting for buses. I've been waiting for these late Paleolithic sites more or less since I finished my doctorate, which was in 1986, way back in the Stone Age. And now all of a sudden, we've got 3 or 4 or more sites turning up. And it's very much down to a lot of people actually in this room who've been responsible for making many of these finds. So I'd like to, this is really a joint presentation today involving Darryl and myself. So a lot of what I'm going to say about Farms and Fields is of course her work and our work together. And then I'll mention another site which has turned up in the last few years, which is actually has also got very great potential for further work. So I thought I'd start just by giving you a little bit of an idea about the framework, as Marilyn said. This is according to a very conservative estimate. There's somewhere in the region of about 63 or so late glacial Paleolithic sites. So from the late glacial period, which I'm defining here, according to the ice record, as occurring roughly between about 15,000 and 13,000 calibrated years ago. So that is according to the ice core. And second thing to point out is, in fact, there are many, many more late glacial open-air sites than the sheltered or the covered sites. We have somewhere in the region of 200 plus. And these are represented, not all of them, by the yellow triangles, and the red triangles represent the caves. And as you can see, in some areas there's a close correlation between them. And of course, Farms and Fields doesn't lie very far from the famous cave sites of the Creswell Crags. So another thing which has actually happened relatively, or has become clear, is that they're very geographically widespread, these sites. So they include places like the Scilly Islands, where late glacial Paleolithic sites or finds have turned up. Up here in Scotland, in fact, even further north in Orkney. And then recently, a potential find of late glacial age from the Alice and Gwendolyn cave here in Ireland. So the main point about the Scilly site and the Irish is that it would have involved sea crossings. So people would have had to move, in order to get to Ireland, and the Scillies would have needed to cross some stretch of water. And to point out that, in fact, for convenience, we separate the late glacial archaeology into 2 phases. An early phase, which is known as the Creswellian, which is the upper of the 2 there, which dates to the period of the last glacial interstadial, so a warm period. So soon after the warming, appears this Creswellian culture, if you like, followed by a second stage later on in the interstadial, known as the Federmesser. And in fact, much of our knowledge of the late glacial period derives from Europe. And in fact, our early archaeology is of this period is sometimes referred to as the late and final Magdalenian. And that is because we're fairly certain that there is a connection with Europe, the European mainland, and to emphasize that Britain was recolonized from Europe. So we have a series of local variants, as I mentioned with Creswellian. Where it seems the pointer seems to have stopped working. Sorry, I was thinking one. What have I done? Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, and now I can see what I'm showing, so I don't have to look back all the time. So, yes, just to show that Britain is very much related in terms of being repopulated from the continent. So we have local variants, and those local variants are known as the Hamburgian here in northern Germany and the Creswellian. But they are essentially related to the Magdalenian. That was the only point I wanted to make. So we can see it's reasoned that these people were of the late Lace were presumably specialised hunters of large game, reindeer and horse, and that as these animals moved north, so people followed them from the continent into Britain over what of course was dry land, but possibly with large rivers here in between. And we know a lot about the European evidence, and therefore what might be a good sort of parallel for what we have in Britain. So, for example, there's some major excavations in the 1960s in places in the Paris Basin where they've excavated, they've stripped whole land surfaces that consist, this rubble actually represents a site with a hearth here, lots of bones of reindeer and stone tools. And in some rare instances, it's been possible to show that there are structures. I mentioned the hearths here. There are also the bases of tents, and very rarely, too, evidence of hafted artifacts. So, for example, these reconstructions here are based on finds from French sites at Passavant, where they found a bone point with hafted flints on either side that looks very much like a projectile. So these things are not common, but they occur in France, very close to the Channel, and so we ought perhaps to be finding things of this kind in Britain. And one other thing to point out is, of course, you need the right conditions of preservation for bone to actually survive. So unless you find calcareous deposits or waterlogged deposits, it's very rare that we find the fauna, the animal bones and the antler and the ivory that you get in these rare examples. So, I would say that all things considered, there ought to be very high potential for finding sites in similar locations in Britain. So, for example, in low-lying positions close to the edges of shallow rivers, braided channels, near confluences where animals might have crossed. So these are all places that we should be thinking about, looking for potential sites. And I want to talk about two examples. This is the first one at Farndon Fields. Of course, it's very close to us here in Newark, as I'm sure we all know. And this was is a community-based project that started life off as Ice Age Journeys and led, of course, by Darryl, who I think you can all see in the photo here, and her team of stalwart field walkers, including myself occasionally. And basically, the wonderful strengths of this is that it's run very much locally from here, but it does involve outside specialists like myself, who've always been made to feel very welcome. So what sort of sites would we be looking for? Well, as I said, this could be the sort of thing that we could be imagining, migrating herds of reindeer. This is taken from a photograph from Norway. So we have to sort of reimagine ourselves back into these Ice Age landscapes. And this is the area of, here's a map view of the area that we've been looking at, showing a very flat local topography. And this is some wonderful work that Ian Ross has done, showing the high spots, but showing overall a very flattish landscape between the two rivers of the Devon and the Trent. And the blue outline is the area that we've been working in. This shows you a better picture of the Trent here and the Devon with Newark just over here. And these represent some of the fine spots of late glacial artifacts that we've been finding together as a result of the field walking. And actually the previous slide was to make the point, sorry, I should have done that, which is, of course, this is very close to the confluence of the two rivers and may potentially have been some form of perhaps crossing point or a good place to locate yourself in this sort of landscape. Another potentially important feature of the landscape that we should be thinking about is Lake Humber. And this is this blue here represents the potential maximum extent of the lake in the late glacial. It is only an estimate, and you can see farms and fields here located towards the edge of this lake. And we have to think of it possibly as a major barrier to the movement of peoples in an east-west sense. And maybe that they directed their movements more in a north-south sense because of this lake. We don't know exactly the level of the lake when Farndon was occupied. It may have shrunk to a much smaller, well, it certainly did shrink to a much smaller size, possibly by 15,000 years ago. We're going to hear more about this in the next talk by Colin Baker. But if we look at the proposed level about 15,000 years ago, this is according to a recent paper by Fairbairn and Mark Bateman, it shows, again, we can superimpose the position of Creswell Crags and Farndon not far from the edge of this very large lake. And this must have been important from a landscape point of view to the people living there in terms of how animals may have gravitated towards this sort of site, this lake edge, and a good place for collecting plant foods and other resources. So, looking a bit about the history of the work at Farndon in more detail, following some years of field walking and then an evaluation prior to construction of the new A46 trunk road, Darrell and Roger Jacoby reported diagnostic late glacial finds from this area. And this includes end scrapers on the ends of blades and very distinctive shouldered point. So according to their view, which I very much agree with, the repertoire of tools and plating technology mirrors that known from the late glacial interstadial sites of Magdalenian and the earliest Fedemesser, so linking it with Europe. And this is what Darrell and Roger wrote in 2009. Since that work, or after that work, following that work, Cotswold Wessex Archaeology then undertook evaluative study in advance of the road scheme. And despite many interventions, which you'll see here in these squares, in fact they had relatively little success. And yet we know subsequently that this area is very, very rich in finds. So really does suggest that one has to choose the right sort of strategy in order to find sites of late glacial type. They're not easy to find. That just shows the areas where they did find artifacts. And so it's clear that in order to find sites of this kind, you really do have to hand dig quite large areas, and this became apparent from the Cotswold Wessex archaeology work. What they did find, though, during their excavation, despite, as it were, slight disappointment of not finding very large concentrations, they did actually find well-preserved in situ archaeology when they started excavating. And this shows, for example, a scatter of very small chips and flakes and blades. And this, by the way, is not disturbance, it's just their drain pipe to hold the plastic down. But this was a very nice, undisturbed scatter just below the surface. Show how fragile these sites really are. Now, what is fascinating is, and unique so far for an open-air site in Britain, is that we have two sorts of archaeology represented from these two periods that I mentioned. So, for example, there's a slightly higher scatter known as Federmesser, from a slightly later period, and this main Creswellian scatter from lower down. So these are separated in depth and by time. And what they show is, this image neatly shows, is the Creswellian. It shows the position of the seated napper as defined by the scatter. So here's a scatter of finds, and they really do look like you would imagine you were sitting there and actually napping a core, producing blades and flakes and so on. So this scatter looks, not only is it in situ, but actually marking the original position of a flint napper. So that actually shows how good the preservation can actually be. Now, the other point to make is that these are some of the artifacts from the Creswellian scatter superimposed onto one of the cores. So not only are there refits showing that the artifacts haven't moved very far, but you can place them, as it were, onto a core so that you can tell at what stage the core itself was abandoned. Now, fascinatingly, the core wasn't actually found here, it was found slightly further away. But it does indicate that it shows us the techniques that were being used at the site, and the fact that you have flakes from a core that fit back together to show where napping actually took place. And again, this is very unusual, or hasn't been documented so much in the late glacial in Britain. This graph by Phil Harding also shows the importance of why it's necessary to excavate rather than just field walk. These objects here, between about 3 and 6 centimetres, were field walked in grey. The rest of these artefacts actually come from the excavation, and shows just exactly what you miss in field walking. Not surprising in a way, but when you employ sieving, you get a much more complete collection of artefacts. So it just goes to show that the field collected material as compared to the excavated material, how much of the smaller debris is missed. Now, just one or two other small points. Further evidence of this Creswellian comes from various technological signatures, and one of those signatures is this special technique known as the en éperon technique, which is a particular way of preparing the blade before you remove it from the core. And this, if you like, is a major identification point specific to the Creswellian. So that occurs on the artefacts, which is very nice to show. Likewise, the retouch tools. These are very, very typical of the ones that we found in field walking. They include things like burins here, graving tools, scrapers, and they're very distinctive of this late glacial period and show a little bit about the range of activities that were taking place, involving the scraping of hides and presumably the working of bone and antler using these burins. So that's some of the work that's summarising progress since the. That's summarising how things were a few years ago, and it's interesting that the tools look very similar to those recovered from Creswell Crags, which lies only about 30 miles away. So again, summarising the progress since the road was built, this image shows LiDAR topography that I mentioned before. The white dots represent the individual late glacial finds, flint finds from field walking, and this actually has to be updated because this is only as far as 2015, I think. The star here, or the star that should show up, here we go, represents the Cotswold Wessex scatters, or scatter that was excavated, and the squares represent the scatters identified and revisited by us from field walking over the years. So there's a lot more flint work that's shown up since the building of the road. The other thing to report, which isn't such good news, is that we've identified very dense scatters of flints that have been field walked since 2013 and beyond, and already they show considerable damage on them due to quite deep ploughing. Sorry, here we are. So we've got deep ploughing, which really, and this is an example of a clod that was recently turned up, and in it was a piece of beautifully preserved flint that wasn't damaged, and therefore was absolutely in situ. So this is one of the problems we have all the time, that the landscape here is being degraded and in situ deposits are being disturbed and destroyed. And there's not an awful lot that we can do about it except to record it when we're allowed onto the land. 10 minutes. Right, I'll better speed up then. Okay, so just to say, these are some of the excavations from the, some of the field walk clusters. So from the different parts of the area, this I think is on the western side of the road. On the eastern side of the road, they look very, very similar. Similar sorts of tools, including these en-éperon blades with en-éperon butts and back material, which isn't too different. So we're talking about quite a large area of deposit. And just to say that we followed it up as well with mapping on this western side of the road. And the mapping included auguring. And what was fascinating to the auguring, which is sort of just putting small holes, small pores into the ground, is that they showed this very well preserved sequence with cover sands. And these cover sands are very important because they're a natural geological glacial deposit, which in fact is known to cover our archaeology. So in other words, there's great potential here for finding more archaeology. This is just to show the pits that we were excavating in that area, and the fact that we have a very nice sequence here of deposits which show these sands, these cover sands, overlying laminated deposits, and archaeology, in situ archaeology, is found in these deposits, but not actually here. And you can see great big frost features as well that penetrated down from the period when the sands were laid down. And not only that, but we've got some very nice dating evidence now, courtesy of Sheffield University and Mark Bateman's team, and these show very nicely this Younger Dryas, this very late glacial cover sands overlying a nice interglacial sequence, where in other parts of the area with these laminated silts and sands, we're finding more archaeology. So, in other words, there's very great potential for finding archaeology. And just to say, remind ourselves that this is very, very close to the plough zone, and this is one of the problems, again, to make sure that these sites are salvaged, or at least we know something about them before they're completely destroyed. Okay, I'm just going to have to whiz through, and this is some of the work that we will hope to continue in the future. This includes more field working. We've more or less worked out the extent of the late glacial, what we call alluvium, and at least doubled the area known that was mapped by the BGS, the British Geological Survey. We know a lot about the cover sands now in the adjacent alluvium, and we've found areas where we may very well locate more in situ deposits, this time on the east side of the Devon. So lots more that, all things permitting, that we'll be able to continue to work on. I'm just going to have to take you very quickly through some of the work at another location in the Wey Valley. This is in Surrey. I'm not going to be able to say very much about it, unfortunately. But other excavations, just to show that they're very, very well preserved sites with scatters that we know of. This from the development of a fire station, produced a wonderful scatter of undisturbed lithic artifacts, showing where they've come from in terms of the depths and the fact that they're located in a combination of fluvial, that's water-laying, aeolian, wind-blown and slope processes. So they're in sediments that are late glacial and have not greatly disturbed the archaeology. Just to show where they are in the stratigraphy. The distributions of the scatters here, two major scatters and the other scatters of flint. So not too dissimilar to something we can imagine at Barton, but with slightly denser scatters because we've located in situ material as we have at Barton, but not yet hit these real hot spots, but it shows the potential. Just to show you the preservation again is very, very good. Here we have very fresh flints recovered from the site. Some of them we've been able to look at them in terms of microwear analysis, looking at the polishes on them, which are the result of wear traces. This is a backed tool fragment that we think was probably a projectile, and shows rather interestingly these microscopic linear impact traces, we think caused by impact when the flint has struck another hard material such as bone. In other cases, a perforator here which shows evidence of possible antler or bone working activity on the tip of a perforator. We have examples of this also up here in the Midlands. A burin here that appears to be used for engraving or even percussion as well. Sorry to rush through all of these. And work that Alison Roberts has been doing on the refitting, which shows a lot of material goes back together again, not only telling us about the method of the technology, but also the fact that the material isn't disturbed, it's been dropped more or less where it was made. And here, some more refits showing the great potential for this sort of study. And the other final point I want to make before I come to my conclusions is that it's rather interesting that once you start looking for these sites, they start turning up, I won't say everywhere, but there are a lot of sites around. And in fact, here is another site at Wey Manor Farm, which is located only 11 miles downstream on the Wey, which then meets up as a tributary of the Thames up here. And this site is fascinating. Although it was excavated a while ago, it shows very similar artifacts that were found, including these rather odd-looking scalar pieces. including backed material, not that dissimilar to what we find up here at Farnham Fields. Well, that's really interesting that there are a lot more sites this time to be found. So I just wanted to finish up with a bit of I suppose, an idea about how we might develop future strategies for looking for these sorts of sites. I think it's very clear that that there's very high potential for finding some more sites at this time, provided we are looking, of course, in the right places. And I think the right places are going to be river catchments, floodplains, confluences, for example, as at Farnham, mouths of gorges that I think we'll hear about this afternoon from Lyndon Cooper, and the fact that we'll get very good survival if we're looking for particular sorts of buried landscapes. As I said before, you've got to think yourself into a late glacial landscape. If you've got late glacial deposits that cap the sediments that you're interested in, these cover sands, that's one place to look and start mapping, and also to think about preservation. So if you can get close to places where you'll either get waterlogging or calcareous sediments. So my final slide, thank you for indulging me, is really just to come back to, I realise I'm preaching to the converted here, but just to say that field walking is absolutely essential to identify artefacts, followed by mapping of deposits, and test pitting, of course, in promising areas. You can use all sorts of methods of detection, including LiDAR, which has been used very successfully at Farnham. I think it's important, of course, to keep up-to-date records via the flows, the finds liaisons officers, and via the HERs, and therefore to keep the planning process, or to keep the planners informed, and ensure that well-informed planning decisions are made. And I think the most important message I have is that we really must continue. That's not the most important message. The most important message is that we must continue to liaise and work with amateurs and volunteers. And that's something I think I've been taught by Farnham. I've known it, of course, before then, but it really has come home to me how much we not only rely on, but in fact, I certainly got a lot of pleasure from working with volunteers on this wonderful community project that we're celebrating today. Thank you very much.